Glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace to people of goodwill. In this video, I'd like to share with you an interesting historical document which has relevance to One West history. It's a 30-year-old polemic that Dr. York put out against One West, titled 360 Questions to Ask the Israeli Church. And it's a book which resembles like a thick magazine, with over 200 pages. And in the book, Dr. York makes clear that at least part of it was written in 1995. He says that explicitly. My current guess is that York probably started the book before the Masha King David split, but completed it after the split, perhaps without even knowing about the split. Now, I actually purchased this copy back in the late 90s, like 1998 or 1999, from a member of Dr. York's group back when it was called Holy Tabernacle Ministries. And in this video, I mainly intend to just turn through every page so that way, as to document it, and so that way interested individuals can look at this. If there's a particular page you want to see, you can pause the video and look at it more closely. Hopefully it'll upload in a quality that makes it legible, at least on a desktop or laptop. I also intend to hand this copy off to Vocab Alone, because he's building quite a repository of Israelite-related works and stuff like that, and I think he's going to attempt to scan this. But that's not an easy task, because the book is in bad shape. It's not the highest quality. It's very delicate, and it's crumbling at this point. So who knows? And in this video, I'll focus in on certain portions like this. Now, in this portion here, Dr. York casts aspersions on the quality of the translation in the King James Version. And then he proudly declares at the bottom of this excerpt on your screen, quote, "Bear in mind that if you were to take my translation to an unbiased expert of the Aramic or Hebrew language, I can guarantee that they will acknowledge my translation as correct," end quote. Now, the book has lots of examples of his personal alternative translations of select verses from the Old Testament, as well as other corpora, and that's the case with many of the works that he produced. But with what we just read in mind, I wanted to show a particular example of such. And as you see here, he presents the text in some sort of variation of the Phoenician or so-called Paleo-Hebrew script, or perhaps a script based on that script. And then he presents the text in the Ashuri script, which is to say the now standard Hebrew square script. And what he presents is not without its problems or errors. There are clear typographical errors. Like here, for example, he clearly has Yod, Ayin, Kof, and then presumably Beit, but maybe Reish in the Paleo script, where he should have had Beit Nunwa. Now, of course, any of us are susceptible to making typographical errors. I, of course, have done so many times over the years. So this isn't a huge problem, but I thought I would point such out in light of what we just read. I would also note that he provides a breakdown of the text, but it's fairly clear that he was working from some sort of concordance, like Strong's Concordance. Perhaps he was working with an interlinear, which was based on Strong's Concordance. And I say that because one clear clue that someone is relying on a tool like Strong's Concordance is when they reduce the verbs to their roots without any attempt to discuss how those verbs are conjugated, or, much less what verb stem they might be in, right? And one sees that throughout his breakdowns of the Hebrew text. But as a disclaimer, I really want to make clear that I'm not trying to pick on him, considering that he was developing this in 1995, this remains on a certain level impressive, right? The ability to produce text in a variation of the Phoenician script was not a simple matter back in 1995, right? It was nowhere near as easy as it is now. So to be clear, back in 1995, I myself would not have been able to produce a text like this. So credit where credit is due, in that regard. And I intend to show a few other excerpts, things that stood out for me as interesting, but mainly I'm just going to flip through the book, as again, this is an attempt to document this book for those who are interested. Now, I'm not going to pretend that the arguments in this book are particularly good. A lot of them are bad. A lot of the questions that he asks are irrelevant or hard to understand the intention behind them and so forth. But nonetheless, just want to work my way through the text. Oh, and by the way, here's another example among many examples of his, breakdowns and attempted retranslations of the Hebrew text. Same issue that I mentioned before with the verbs and all that. But moving on. I hope you'll forgive me if this is a bit sloppy. I intend to just sort of freestyle this a bit, and then maybe after the fact I'll go back and do a minor bit of editing. But, mainly, like I said, I just want to flip through this. In case it doesn't get scanned, at least this sort of sloppy flipping through will be available for those who are interested. But nonetheless, like I was saying, the arguments are not stellar, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, but I don't think members of One West were overly impressed, with this book when they saw it. But, here's something else that's interesting. Dr. York shows the cover of the book, Change of Worlds. Now, when I first got this book back in the 90s, and by this book I mean Dr. York's polemic against One West, I had no idea what Change of Worlds was, but for those who don't know, I have a video on the subject. It's One West's redaction and reworking of a book that was written by Edward Meredith Bibbins, who would later be known as Abba Bivens. So that's interesting that this historical document gets alluded to, gets mentioned in Dr. York's work. Oh, and by the way, make a mental note of that symbol there, that Star of David or hexagram, whatever you want to call it, with the interlocking black and white triangles, with the white triangle pointing up, because that's going to become relevant later in the book, at least vis-a-vis the sort of polemics that later One West splinter groups like GMS would promote. Dr. York sort of was doing some of the same thing, and you'll see what I mean in a little while when I get to the relevant pages, but just keep that symbol in mind. It's a symbol that One West put on their documents, and it's a symbol which, if I'm not mistaken, the neo-ICUPK continues to use to this day, so keep that in mind. But moving on, we'll continue to flip through this and let's see, go through some of these other pages. There's some other interesting stuff. I think pretty soon we'll come across a section on King James. Here we go, and another One West work, Images of Israel and History. But Dr. York gets into the whole debate about whether King James was quote-unquote white or quote-unquote black. He takes the position that King James was quote-unquote white, and you can see him sort of presenting his case there. Garfield Reed might find this section interesting. As I understand it, Garfield Reed will be debating a One West veteran on that topic shortly. But there's all sorts of other stuff that, Dr. York gets into. He polemicizes against the King James Bible, of course. But putting that aside, another thing that I want to find, and I'll focus in on it when I do find it, is when he gets into the appearance of members of One West on, popular talk shows like Richard Bay and Morton Downey. Here's some more stuff on King James, but I want to jump to that. Here we go. This section is particularly fun. Let me actually zoom in on this portion right here. One thing that you'll notice if you look at the caption at the bottom is that Dr. York confuses Ariah and Yeshaya, and throughout the book he posts pictures of Ariah and refers to him as Yeshaya, so that's a common mistake that he makes in the book. But putting that aside, I want to turn to a particularly fun part of this section of the book, and that's this portion right here, in which Dr. York recounts how on the Richard Bay show, an Israeli woman had asked Ariah in Hebrew where he learned Hebrew, and he didn't know what she was saying. He accused her of speaking Yiddish, and he yelled out, Shammai, 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 which is, Shema from Deuteronomy 6:4 in the Lashon Kodash pronunciation. And, he told them that means listen and so forth. I do not have this footage. I'm glad that Dr. York recounted it. Hopefully one day someone will find this footage and put it up. I actually reached out to Richard Bay years ago. He said he doesn't have access to the footage. He recommended I reach out to the channel. I don't know. But whatever the case, it's certainly a fun anecdote that Dr. York is sharing right here. And he makes it a point to say that the woman spoke to him in Hebrew, not Yiddish. And then right underneath that, there's this part here where apparently a guy asked if they had a bar mitzvah. And then on the next page, Dr. York says that they asked a man in the audience, and he said he wasn't familiar with that term, which is interesting because I know the ICGJC would have bar mitzvahs, and Ariah apparently had a bar mitzvah. But moving on from that, they show pictures of the leaders. There's Ariah on the left, even though it says Yeshaya, and Masha on the right. There's pictures of Shar here, although you have to look at the lower caption to get who that is in the upper photos there. And then Dr. York recounts when the same guys appeared on the Morton Downey Jr. show. And, he focuses in on Masha wearing cowboy boots. Apparently Morton Downey Jr. Ribbed him a little bit about that. Masha had claimed, hey, boots are in the Bible. But as you can see here, Dr. York playfully says, sorry, Brother Masha, cowboy boots are cowboy boots. And then moving on, oh, here's a picture of Arya in 1992 holding up a book about icons, presumably Russian icons. Let's see, there's something about King James there on the left, But moving on from that, I think now we're about to get to the part where yes, here we go, the logo with the hexagram, or the Star of David with the interlocking triangles, with the white triangle pointing up, the black triangle pointing down. And as Dr. York notes on the next page, actually not here, let me go one more over. Yes, right here. As he notes, this symbol was actually used by Blavatsky's Theosophical Society. Now, ultimately, that doesn't have to mean anything. It could merely be a coincidence, but think about it in the context of the sorts of polemics that later One West, descended splinter groups put out, especially GMS, which would appeal to things like Codex Magica by Tex Mar. They would push this argument constantly, like this group or this individual employs this symbol, and this other nefarious group or individual, employed a similar symbol or nearly identical symbol. So, therefore they're working together. If you're going to play that game, note that One West itself was clearly using that, hexagram or six-pointed star that specifically had interlocking black and white triangles, with the white triangle pointing up and the black triangle pointing down, and the same symbol was used by Blavatsky's Theosophical Society. Like I said, I don't really think that really means much, but for those One West descended groups and individuals who want to play that game, note that the One West leadership could be implicated once you accept that sort of logic. And that's why this is interesting, And I guess that could also be applied to the current neo-ICUPK, because if I'm not mistaken, they're still using that symbol, that historical One West symbol. But I digress. Let's move on from that. I'll just flip through more pages. Like I said, mainly I'm just trying to... Oh, he gets into the cross swords, which is interesting because, Tahar would later attack the cross swords that were used and assembled by the ICGJC, which is funny because it appeared on one of his own garments that came up in videos a decade or more ago. But moving on from that, there's Change of Worlds again on the right. Let's see what else we have. I hope you find this interesting. Maybe some of you will see stuff that I don't see as you flip through this. Lots of stuff about music groups, because Dr. York used to be in some sort of music group in the 70s, so he gets into, what music groups he was with or wasn't with, and whether or not the, One West looks like certain groups from the 70s. It's all quite silly. But here he gets into the tribes chart, so he does spend some time attacking the tribes chart, or at least some of their arguments for certain breakdowns for certain tribes, especially the so-called northern tribes, or the Latin tribes, as they like to say, among some One West descended groups. But whatever the case, he devotes some time to the tribes chart. Oh, here's something interesting. Let me point this out. He shows a lot of his depictions of various figures from history, and there's a depiction of Esau here that I want to find. Oh, this is more stuff on the tribes here. I remember that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can find the picture of Esau. Eventually that'll come up, but whatever the case, I'll just keep flipping through, and we'll arrive at it shortly. But it's somewhere right around here. I remember looking at it and finding it interesting because Dr. York actually had shifting positions on who the Edomites were in his works back in the 90s. But we'll come to that shortly, I'm sure. But like I said, Ben-Ami Carter, whatever the case, as I was saying, you're going to... Some of you, if you take the time to look through this, you'll find things interesting that I don't cover, So you looked at, here we go. This is Esau right here. He says Esau and Jacob, but I think he juxtaposed it. The one on the left, it says Jacob, but that's supposed to be Esau. And like I said, Dr. York kind of changed his position on this. There was a period where one of his scrolls endorsed One West's position about whites being Edomites, but in this book, he's clearly attacking that position. There's some stuff on Muhammad there, a page before. But whatever the case, let's just keep flipping through. Like I said, there's over 200 pages, so there's quite a lot to go through here. And at this point, we're really just slightly past the halfway mark, so I hope you forgive me if I just start flipping through without focusing too much on what's here. Like I said, if there's something in particular that catches your eye, you can pause the video and take a look at that particular page, that catches your eye. But I'm just going to flip through for now because I want to get to the end where he gets into a former member of his own group who went on to become a member of One West, apparently a teacher at One West, who polemicized against Dr. York's group from that position. So that's somewhat interesting, but that's at the end of the book. For now, I'll just keep flipping through the pages so as, like I said, to document it for those who are interested. There's more of his breakdowns of the Hebrew text and so on, but let's just keep going through this. Let's see, more depictions of historical figures. See, a lot of interesting artwork in Dr. York's books. He depicted so many biblical figures and extra biblical figures. Here's some stuff on Native Americans. Dr. York, aside from going through his Muslim phase and Egyptian phase, he also went through a Native American phase. So the various stages for Dr. York, and that's quite interesting. But let's see if anything else catches our eye. That's interesting depiction here. If you look at the different, Paleo-Hebrew texts, that text on the left is interesting. He says right there in the caption that it's from something produced by One West, and you can see the One West diacritic at the top. But what's interesting there is I think that's a fragment from the One West's version of the Lord's Prayer. Like, you can sort of infer that from the little bit that's available, So I'm guessing Dr. York also had access to their Hebrew booklet. I wish he showed more of it or delved more into it, but whatever the case, that's interesting that it seems when he shows an example of Hebrew put forth by One West, he seems to show a fragment of their version of the Lord's Prayer. But moving on from that, we're about 150 pages through, so we're roughly 3/4 of the way through this book, So a lot of this, I'm not trying to be disrespectful towards Dr. York, but a lot of this doesn't strike me as particularly interesting. A lot of it feels like filler. Here's some more stuff on Native Americans and Abraham Lincoln and so on and so forth. But whatever the case, like I said, maybe you'll find some of this stuff interesting. Maybe various viewers will find portions of this interesting. There's not a lot between here and the end where he gets into the former member that I particularly find interesting, but I do think that that portion on the former member is interesting, and we'll get to that shortly, as at this point I'm admittedly just racing through the text here. There is one thing before I reach the end that I find interesting, and he shows, an ancient inscription which reads Yeshua. That's somewhere right around here. I'll get to it shortly. And he sort of presents it as a counterweight to the idea of Christ's name being Yahawashi. So that's interesting. And, here it is, right here. So he shows this inscription. Of course, people, they might want to bicker about the pronunciation, proponents of Lashon Kodash, but at least you have the string of characters, Yod, Shin, Wa, Ayin. So he shows an ancient example of that. And that's interesting. And like I said, he presents it as a counterweight to the idea of Christ's name being Yeshua. So that's interesting, presenting Yeshua in contrast to Yahawashi. Okay, points to Dr. York on that one. But moving on from that, here he has a section on the days of the week, and this goes on for several pages, and I don't know, perhaps some of you find that interesting. It is interesting on some level, but whatever the case, we're basically at the end of the book, and I'm about to get to the portion that I wanted to get to, where he gets into a former member. It's right around here. We're basically at the end, here we go. He's talking about what were members of the of the Israeli church before they joined the church, and he points out that among other things, some of them were members of his group, and he gives an example of a member who was a member of the group during his Muslim phase. He shows an application from back when his group was called the Ansaaru Allah Community, which is what it was called when Bilal Phillips wrote a book about the group. He shows this guy's application. This is a guy who went on to be some sort of a teacher with One West. I'm actually not familiar with this person, but it's interesting that he shows the guy's application from when the guy applied to be a member of York's group, and then he left York's Muslim group and went on to join One West and polemicized against One West. So, Dr. York retaliated by showing his application. I don't know. I thought that was interesting. But with that, we're at the end of the book. There's the guy right there, as a member of York's group on the left, and then as a teacher in One West on the right, or some One West group, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that guy, but it's interesting. Maybe some of you are. It's interesting that he went that route. But with that, this is the end of the book. It's interesting that he boasts, that, they're not ready for what's coming in part 2, but he never came out with a part 2. So that also is somewhat humorous, but that's it. That's the end of the book. There's a prayer here on the left, and then the rest of it is just, advertisements for his, other works, his many, many booklets, which he calls scrolls, So I guess the list is interesting, but that's it. That's the end of the book, and I'll show you the back. He has his P.O. box in Georgia, but that's it. Hope you found this interesting. Feel free to share any comments, whether positive or negative, or any questions, comments, criticisms, whatever the case. God bless.